Dr. Olmsted, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. I want to speak with you about your book, which is titled Real Enemies, Conspiracy Theories, and American Democracy, World War One to 9/11. But before we go to your book, I'm wondering, are there any notable conspiracy theories from, say, 1789, the birth of our republic, to 1914, which is the year World War One started, that you'd like to highlight for us that sort of stands out for you?
Oh, sure. It's not that conspiracy theories suddenly start in the United States in 1914. There are many,
Yeah.
many before that. Indeed, you could say that there are conspiracy theories in English-speaking North America going back to the t first time that English colonists set foot on the continent. So even before the
Wow.
birth of the United States. It's just that in the early days, up through say the early 20th century, most conspiracy theories in the English colonies and then in the United States had to do with marginalized groups or minority groups. So that, for example, the United States was mostly Protestant. So there were conspiracy theories about Catholics, about Jews.
Oh, yeah.
In the 19th century, there are conspiracy theories about Mormons. Also, conspiracy theories about racial groups, about enslaved people, about Native people, about immigrants. So lots of conspiracy theories in the early days about the sphere of the other, that there are these different racial, ethnic, religious groups that are sneaking into America and going to harm the native-born white Protestants. Um,
And it's interesting as you identify some of these groups: Jews, Catholics, Mormons, natives, immigrants, and enslaved blacks. They probably didn't have as much access to, let's say, media and newspapers to counter these conspiracy theories. Am I close to the mark here?
Right. Well, I mean, there are conspiracy theories that are spread by word of mouth, even before the invention of the printing press. You could go back to medieval Europe, and there's the blood libel against Jews.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but certainly, as more people are reading and there's more print media circulating, then there's more conspiracy theories. And yes, of course, it's harder for marginalized groups to have access to those
Yeah.
media to counter them.
So the period covered by your book starts from World War One in 1914 and goes to 9/11. Was World War One a turning point?
Yes, I think it was. It's a turning point because it's at that point in US history that we start seeing a lot of conspiracy theories about the US government.
Oh, okay.
So for a long time before that, you had conspiracy theories, but Americans were saying, oh, it is the immigrants that are trying to overthrow the government, or it is the Catholics who have allegiances to the Pope who are trying to overthrow the American experiment. But what happens starting in World War One is that's when you get a U.S. government that has that starts to expand, has a lot more power, and also has the power to surveil dissidents. So Congress passes the Espionage and Sedition Acts in 1917 and 1918 that
During
effectively
during World War One.
during World War One.
Yeah.
So it's then that the US government effectively criminalizes dissent. You know, you're not allowed to make speeches that undermine the war effort. And so there are not only these laws, but then there are also these intelligence agencies in the Justice Department, in the military, that start spying on Americans to collect information about are they opposing the war. And so it's exactly this point in history when the US government gets enough power and capability to spy on American citizens that Americans start to have conspiracy theories about the government. And they start to say, no, I'm not so much worried about, I still am worried about immigrants,
Yeah.
but really the real threat to democracy is not other people, it is the government that we have in fact elected.
That is interesting. Um, just 2 points I'm wondering, and pardon me if they're irrelevant. One, I'm wondering that in that decade of 1914 and the 1910s, taxation also came to be, which did that have any factor sort of tick off Americans? Now they're taxing us.
Yes, although, the income tax doesn't affect that many people at the beginning. It's mainly affects the very high income
Oh,
levels.
that's right. That's
So
right.
the war is mostly financed by Liberty bonds, so people voluntarily loan the
Hmm.
government money. But I think certainly the start of the income tax is important because it lays the foundation for a state that is going to grow.
How,
And
how,
so
how
as the
about
state grows, people begin to suspect it of various crimes.
how about prohibition, the amendment for prohibition, or the amendment which gave women the franchise, the right to vote? Did they sort of rub some men, conservative men, in a weird way funny, and conspiracy theories start out of that?
Well, prohibition is certainly a sign that the US government is gaining more power. Well, it
Yeah.
makes it illegal to manufacture or sell alcoholic beverages throughout the United States. So that's a really strong government, really strong state intervention in society and economy.
Telling you what you cannot drink at home, right?
Right. Well, I mean, if you had already bought it before Prohibition and you had it at home, you could drink it at home. But,
Yeah.
certainly there's a vast expansion of government power. I don't think the suffrage amendment was quite as important, although it
Hmm.
is showing federal supremacy because it's telling the states that they can no longer discriminate against women in the franchise.
Yeah. So, what are some notable conspiracy theories between World War One and 9/11?
Well, I mean, that's a big time
Period.
span.
Yeah.
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 But you start with conspiracy theories about World War One, people who oppose the war or who after the war come to see it as a mistake, think
Oh,
that the US was tricked into joining the war by a combination of the British and bankers who had loaned money to the British and wanted to make sure they got paid back, and arms manufacturers for obvious reasons, that there was a conspiracy among those various groups. And so those are the conspiracy theories about World War One. There's conspiracy theories about World War Two, that Franklin Roosevelt knew the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor and deliberately withheld that information from the commanders at Pearl Harbor because he wanted to get into a war against the Nazis who were allied with the Japanese. Um,
that would be pretty audacious.
it would be, yes, it would be extremely complicated
Yeah.
as well. There's no evidence for it at all. Um,
I'm wondering, did that Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory start developing immediately afterwards, or is this sort of a retrospective development years later?
Well, it goes through a couple of phases. There are actually during the war, there are
Hmm.
some people that are they're on the far right in American politics. They
Would
hate
that be
Frank.
Republican, right? Is that
Yeah, Republican right,
uh-huh.
although certainly not the mainstream of the Republican Party.
Okay?
And the far right of the Republican Party, isolationists, they didn't want to get into the war. And so once the US is in the war, they say, well, how did this happen? It can't be that I was wrong. It has to be that, we are in the wrong war against the wrong enemy. We should really be fighting the communists, not the fascists. So how did this happen? Well, it must be because there's a liberal president who, manipulated us into the war. So those
I
actually
see.
I mean, they start communicating with one another, various far right intellectuals and activists during the war. They don't publicize it though, because it would be very unpopular during the
Very
war,
unpatriotic.
right? But after the war, then they do start publishing Pearl Harbor conspiracy theories.
These people that came up with the Pearl Harbor conspiracy, they're not necessarily uh, Nazi sympathizers, right?
No, although some of them do become Holocaust deniers. So,
Really?
yeah. Definitely is an affinity there, where at a minimum they think, Hitler's not really a threat to us. Why are we at war with him? And as I say, they're on the extreme right, so they want to go to
Yeah.
war with the Soviet Union. So they say, how on earth did we end up in a war fighting Nazis and allied with communists? It must be a big plot.
Um, does the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory continue to this day?
Well, it does, although it's different. So as they say,
In what sense is it
it
different?
was a far right conspiracy theory at the beginning,
Uh-huh.
and you can see publications that espouse it through the 50s. Then it sort of dies down. Then it reemerges in the 1970s after Watergate, but it's no longer a far right conspiracy theory. It's more sort of politically neutral, with various conspiracy theorists after Watergate saying, well, Watergate was an example of a president conspiring against the public. Let's look for other examples in the past.
Yeah.
Roosevelt in World War II also conspired against the public.
Interesting, interesting. And now in the 2020s and the 2010s, is Pearl Harbor sort of a conspiracy theory for history nerds? Because I see it once in a while on social media. I'm like, what? We're still discussing this?
Right. Well, I mean, it doesn't have any support among academic historians.
Yeah,
So it doesn't even have the kind of support where some people would say, like with the Kennedy assassination, gosh, really don't know what happened there.
yeah,
Definitely there's agreement in historians that Roosevelt did not know about that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th. But, it's the kind of thing that is popular because it's the kind of conspiracy theory where people like to say, well, I know more than you do.
yeah,
You
yeah,
think
yeah.
you know about World War II, but I actually know the truth.
Having a couple of drinks and then these things come out. That's really
Right.
interesting. So moving forward from Pearl Harbor, one of the big ones obviously is JFK. Is there anything else that stands out before that in the
Well,
50s?
well, in the 50s, it's anti-communist conspiracy theories, Joe
Oh,
McCarthy, that
yeah.
there are communists in the US government who are secretly manipulating foreign policy to benefit the Soviets.
Um, all of these are against the government, and you already said this in the, you know, beginning of our conversation.
Mhm.
Does that mean Americans as a whole had less confidence in our government?
Well, all of these, I think they show distrust of government decisions in war. So in World War One, it was the people who opposed U.S. entry into World War One who thought there was a conspiracy. In World War Two, it's the people who opposed entry into World War Two who thought there was a conspiracy. In the 1950s, there's this generalized fear in the nuclear era that there are secret enemies within who are going to cause America to lose a war against the Soviets. So you see these, periodic concerns about war decisions and this assumption by Americans who oppose a war that they must have been tricked into joining that war.
Mhm.
Wouldn't say, though, that it necessarily reflects widespread distrust of government. It reflects distrust of government of this one subset who opposes U.S. involvement in a war.
A very vocal subset.
Right. Well, especially by the 1950s. Yes, it's very, very vocal.
Yeah.
And in it's after the Vietnam War that you really start to see where they have scientific polling that shows that there's a big loss of trust, steady loss of trust from the 1960s throughout the end of the 20th century up to our own time as more Americans come to distrust the federal government.
Has that been gradually going up or has it been like up and down?
Well, it's up and down, but the overall trend line is down.
You mean confidence is down over line trend?
Confidence is
Yeah.
down. Yes.
Interesting. So we get over McCarthy's witch hunt, the Red Scare and the Communist Scare in the 1950s, and we're slammed with JFK's assassination.
Right. And
That's gotta,
yes, I mean it's ready made for conspiracy theories because of course it's very traumatic to have your president shot.
yeah.
But then and then also the alleged assassin is killed 2 days later. Um, and so this opens up a lot of questions. So there's people from the beginning, maybe close to 50%, who say, I'm not sure we know the whole story. Um, Goes down to maybe 40% of people who believe there's a conspiracy theory. But then by the 1970s, as more information comes out about the CIA working with the mafia to kill Fidel Castro, more and more people start to think that there's connections there, that we don't know everything. And so the percentage that believe in a Kennedy conspiracy theory goes way up to almost, well, more than 80% at times.
Oh, wow. Um, CIA working with mafia. I have a whole section to speak with you about the CIA, so I'm
Okay.
going to leave that there. Um, let's see. With respect to JFK, is this the sort of conspiracy theory that rallied people towards the government initially, or is it the sort of conspiracy theory that sort of added on to our lack of confidence? Kind of
Well,
9/11 rallied people towards the government, right?
right.
That's my perspective. I wasn't around when JFK was shot.
Right. Well, I would say there's a little bit of a similar trajectory in that it certainly rallies people around the government. It makes them feel very patriotic, and they want to support Lyndon Johnson, the new president, at the beginning. But over time, there are more questions that emerge, and so that there is a increasing distrust.
I see.
And it's similar in 9/11. There's a rallying around the flag at the beginning. Then a few years later, as the Iraq War doesn't go well, and there are more questions raised about why the U.S. went to war in Iraq, then there start to be more and more people who question what really happened at 9/11.
Do you think there were more sort of virulent conspiracy theories back in the Vietnam era about the Vietnam War than the Iraq War? I asked that because 55,000, about between 50 to 55,000 Americans died in Vietnam. That was a much bigger loss than Iraq and Afghanistan combined.
Right. Well, I wouldn't say more virulent, but certainly that's a large chunk of the people who believe in Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories is they think that Kennedy would have taken the United States out of Vietnam, and so
Mm.
he was killed to stop him from doing that.
Oh wow, that's the reason they think that he was killed.
Right.
Do you have any inside stories to share with us? Do you have
No,
the answer about who killed JFK?
no, I do not.
We'll be back after a short break to talk about the post-Watergate investigations of the CIA and the FBI. Dr. Olmsted, um, in preparing for this conversation with you, I noted another book of yours. It is titled Challenging the Secret Government, the Post-Watergate Investigations of the CIA and FBI. And you and I talked about the CIA in the last segment a little bit. So I would love for you to share the story behind this book with us, please.
Sure. So the my book, Challenging the Secret Government, is about the investigations of American intelligence agencies after the Watergate scandal. So Richard Nixon resigned in 1974 after
Mm-hmm.
the Watergate scandal, and Americans learned at the end of the Watergate scandal, oh, that the Nixon reelection committee had been systematically spying on its opponents, that it had paid for this espionage with illegal campaign contributions, and that the president had personally directed a cover up of these events. And so once he left office and all of this was proven with the Watergate tapes, a lot of there was pressure on Congress to investigate whether there was anything more. Was the
More.
Watergate
Okay.
more? Was the Watergate scandal just a one-off? Was it just Nixon? Or in fact, had secret agencies in the US government been committing similar crimes and abuses of power before Nixon? And
Ah,
yeah,
that's big.
yeah. And
Wow.
it's really quite a remarkable story because then there was a Democratic Congress and they decided to investigate.
Okay. Were Republicans on board with this?
Republicans were on board. They served on the committees. There was a committee in the House, and then a committee in the Senate, which is the better known one. It was headed by a senator named Frank Church, so it's often called the Church Committee.
Hmm.
And these investigations lasted more than a year, and they had subpoena power, and they had these sensational hearings when they subpoenaed um, the leaders of the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and they investigated going back to the beginning of the Cold War. So this is almost 30 years at that point in history, and tried to find out if these agencies had broken the law or if they had abused the trust of the American people. Some people at the time suggested they were like truth commissions, like
Truth
in some country.
commissions?
Yeah, when you have a revolution against an authoritarian government and the new democratic government comes in and says,
Yeah,
let's
yeah, yeah.
investigate.
Hmm.
This is essentially what the Church Committee and other similar investigations in Congress were doing, was saying, let's find out, let's discover if our government committed crimes against the people. And the motivation there was very idealistic. Oh, they thought, especially the leaders of these investigations, that it's really important that the American people know if their government has lied to them, has committed crimes against them. We need to throw open the closets and find all the skeletons and admit our sins, and then going forward, make sure that these sort of things don't happen again. And
That seems so naive, doesn't it? We're talking about a government. I mean, there are a lot of secrets. I mean, it's a good thing, but you said it's idealistic, and it does sound idealistic. I'm wondering, these people that were running the church commission, what was their political motivation? Were they just looking good in front of their constituents? Is that it?
Well, some people thought that Senator Church definitely did try begin to run for president in 1976. His
Oh,
campaign didn't go anywhere. But I mean, that was the political climate of 1975, that you could think that maybe you could get elected president in 1976 by exposing the crimes of the CIA and FBI.
so when you say since, that sounds so similar to the last few years of our um lives right here. When you say sensational hearings, so was this uh, in the nightly news? Was it in the newspapers daily?
Yes, it was in the newspapers daily. It was in just about all of the hearings were covered on the nightly news. Um, because they uncovered, among other things, with the FBI, they uncovered an FBI program called COINTELPRO, which was
Repeat that, please. What was it called?
COINTELPRO. This was
Okay.
FBI surveillance of American dissidents, various groups. Most of them on the left, although one was on the right, the Ku Klux Klan. But the FBI systematically spied on these various American groups, including the civil rights movement,
Oh,
especially,
including the civil rights movement.
yeah, especially Martin Luther King was personally targeted. And so there were all those revelations about the FBI, also with the CIA, that it had tried to kill foreign leaders, and most notably had worked with the mafia to try to kill Fidel Castro.
Um, so with respect to the CIA, just to be clear, they weren't investigating anything that CIA may have done in the US because the CIA doesn't have jurisdiction in the US, right?
Well, the assassination plots were not in the US. There was another CIA
Yeah,
program that they investigated where the CIA was illegally spying on Americans in the United States.
it was.
Yeah.
Did did that cause, I don't know, a lot of heads to roll in the CIA firings or
No, I mean, it was historical. So by this point, the people who had known about it were no longer in power. And by the time it all came out, there was no appetite to prosecute CIA officers. So,
oh
and in addition, in that case, the presidents had told the CIA to do this, knowing that it was illegal. The presidents had lost faith in the FBI. So you had first President Johnson and then President Nixon telling the CIA to do this domestic espionage.
um just for our audience's clarification and perhaps my own, when we talk about the FBI at that time, you're saying LBJ and then later Nixon. This is still the FBI of Edgar Hoover, right? Who had
Right.
files on pretty much everybody.
Right, right. He was the director for almost 50 years and he died in 1972,
Okay, so into Nixon's almost second term or end of his first term or something like that.
end of his first term. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, so when you look at the FBI, they uncovered FBI program COINTELPRO spying on the left, far left, let's say communist groups and KKK. I'm not getting into the legal aspect of it. Just politically speaking, that wouldn't cause an uproar because, yeah, they're looking into what the KKK is doing. Civil rights is a whole different thing. I mean, uh, were they looking at to like into Black Panthers or the militant groups of the civil rights or everybody? You mentioned Dr. King.
Right. Everybody. They did the Panthers, of course, as you might
Yeah.
expect, but also the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And Martin Luther King, he was spied on by the FBI. They had they listened to his phone conversations. They put microphones in his hotel rooms. And it was just at his house and at his office. Just everything he did was. This is in part because he had criticized the FBI. He didn't think it was doing enough to protect civil rights leaders, and this, offended J. Edgar Hoover to the extent that he became convinced that King was a Soviet agent, or else why else would he be criticizing the FBI?
Oh, I love it. Oh my gosh. So, did this unearthing of FBI's spying on civil rights, including Dr. King, did this cause a political backlash against the FBI?
It did, and they passed some reforms. So, for example, limiting the FBI director to 10 years. So again, you wouldn't have somebody like Hoover in
Exactly.
charge for half a century. And under Hoover, there weren't any black agents or women agents. So
Oh,
gradual diversification of the FBI, new guidelines for them that were issued by the Attorney General to try and, change it from the Hoover personal spy agency into a more professional organization.
yeah. And all of this is happening in a democracy. So we'll be back after a short break to talk about exactly that, conspiracies in democracies such as our own. We'll be right back. Dr. Olmsted, isn't it strange that we have so many conspiracy theories in our country's history? I mean, we're a democracy.
Right. So you could say that, of course, it makes sense in authoritarian countries for people to have conspiracy theories about.
Exactly, because there's not enough information. But
Right.
here,
Right. Well, I think that that's because there is a tension between having the traditions of democracy and transparency in government on the one hand, but also over the last 100 years, the US government having creating secret agencies. Out of necessity in some cases, but having secret agencies that have a lot of secrecy and power who operate behind the scenes without much democratic accountability. And so as a result, Americans start to wonder what those agencies are up to. And especially when there are things like Watergate or the church committee hearings that show that these secret agencies have done things that are illegal or at least questionable, this makes Americans think, well, what else have they been doing that we just haven't heard about yet? So it's this tension and this suspicion of the concentration of secret power.
And then there's the freedom to speak about it. So you start speaking about it, and the conspiracy theory starts. Um, and so, in that respect, do conspiracy theories make sense? Are they logical? Not the
Well, yeah.
theory itself, the fact that they happen.
Mhm. Right. Well, a conspiracy theory is a belief that there is a conspiracy, and you just
Yeah.
haven't been able to prove it yet, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the evidence will emerge at some point. And so certainly there have been times in our history when it has turned out that there were real conspiracies.
Oh,
So I mean, Watergate would be an example of that.
yeah.
If you had a couple of reporters at the Washington Post
Of course.
who believed that there was a conspiracy in the White House. I don't even think they believed at the beginning that it involved the president, but they believed that it involved high officials. And they were treated as conspiracy theorists by some of their editors. Like, you crazy guys,
Really
how can you possibly believe that about our government? Um,
interesting.
and it's only because people within the conspiracy started talking, and there was pressure from the press and from eventually from the Justice Department. And because Nixon taped himself, it's only because of those things that we learned that, in fact, the conspiracy theorists about Watergate, were correct. But it was a true conspiracy.
It was a true conspiracy. Any other examples of wild conspiracy theories that proved to be real?
Well, I would say the other major example would be the Iran-Contra affair. There
Oh,
were
that's right.
some
Yeah.
reporters in 1985 and 1986 who said, you know what, I know Congress has outlawed the sale of weapons to this army in Nicaragua, but I think people in the White House are still sending them arms anyway. And it took a long time for them to get the evidence to prove that this was actually happening, that they weren't just wild conspiracy
Hmm.
theorists.
I guess a third one, I guess, would be the second invasion of Iraq, the second war in Iraq, right?
In that
There were no weapons of mass destruction. Was that a conspiracy theory, though, or was that just we caught our government in a bad act, in a lie?
right. I think that's what that's what happened. You could say that the Bush administration in many ways deceived the
Yeah.
American public about its reasons for going to war in Iraq, but it wasn't quite the conspiracy that
Yeah.
conspiracy theorists alleged, because otherwise if the Bush administration was really involved in a conspiracy to involve Iraq, it probably would have planted weapons of mass destruction and then found them, right?
That would have been really wild as far as conspiracy goes. Um, you know, in this segment, when I started asking you about, well, why do we have conspiracies in our democracy? And you said Americans wonder. You said that phrase a couple of times, which makes me wonder when we use the term Americans and
Mhm.
juxtapose that with conspiracy theories. I want to go back to segment number one again. Are these a minority of Americans? Um, it seems like, and maybe this is just too simple of an analysis, but it seems like Americans that are just working day and night. They got kids, they got family. We don't even have time for conspiracy theories. I'm speaking from my personal experience.
Right. Well, it depends on which conspiracy theory. I mean, there are political scientists who poll all of these conspiracy theories.
Uh-huh.
And so some of the ones that you hear about a lot are actually not believed by very many people, like, say, the moon landing.
Oh,
Um,
geez. Yeah.
about 6% of Americans at various times have said, yes, I think the moon landing was faked. So, very small minority. 9/11 at its peak anyway, there was a pretty good poll in 2006 that showed that 30% of Americans believed that 9/11 had somehow been orchestrated by the Bush administration.
30%?
Yeah, I know that is astonishing. It's still a minority,
Wow.
but this is astonishing. And the Kennedy assassination has been polled over time, so we have really good numbers on that. And the two peaks were in the 1970s and the 1990s, when there were about 80% of Americans, so 4 in 5, who believed that Kennedy had been killed as a result of a conspiracy. Now, I mean, in a way, those questions are a
Wow.
little too broad because it's like,
Yeah.
what kind of conspiracy? Are you saying it was the CIA? Are you saying it's the mob? Are you saying it was the Soviets? Those are all very different things.
Yeah. 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 Um, in the first segment of our conversation, we discussed how World War One was a turning point in the history of conspiracy theories in our country. Uh, I'm wondering, has Mr. Trump's politics of populism now created another turning point in our history of conspiracy theories? Because now you have a president and a former president saying these things.
Right. Yes. So I actually issued a new epilogue for my book in
Oh, wonderful.
2019 that took us up to 2019. Of course, events after 2019, I think,
So we
were
go from World War One to 9/11 and from 9/11 to 2019. Okay.
right. Right. So,
Okay.
um, but yes, and it was an epilogue on the Trump era, or at least the first 3 years of Trump's administration. And yes, I argued that he really helped legitimize conspiracy theories and the use of conspiracy theories in American politics because he embraced so many of them.
Um, earlier, I asked you if the fact that conspiracy theories happen makes sense. Not the substance of the conspiracy theory itself,
Mhm.
just the fact that they happen. And in a way, it sort of, I think, makes sense. People react to things that they don't know, or perhaps for entertainment's sakes. But going back to my question, Mr. Trump's, uh, you know, peddling in conspiracy theories, does that make sense? I'm not getting into politics. I'm talking about a member of the government, a head of a state,
Mhm.
coming up with conspiracy theories about that state.
Well, I suppose it makes sense the way he's doing it because he's saying that there is a deep state that is, conspiring against him, right? So he's making a distinction. I don't know if you'd be able to explain it this way, but this
Yeah,
is this is the way I understand it, between the government and the state, right? The state is the permanent part of the bureaucracy, all the government agencies that are there regardless of who is in charge of the administration. And then there's the government, which is temporary. And
I
so
see.
so he is alleging that the state is conspiring against the government when he is in charge of it.
Have we had that in our history before where, let's say, a senator, cabinet member, or someone very high up has tried this, that the whole, like, government, the deep state is conspiring against me? Uh,
No, I mean, the closest would be Senator McCarthy, who said that there were spies within the State Department and the White House who were working against America's interests. But that's different than saying, like, the FBI
yeah.
is working against America's interests. And McCarthy never would have said that because he was a huge fan of the FBI.
Yeah. Do you think this turning point created by Mr. Trump in the history of conspiracy theories, is this going to create a whole new era of popularity or of conspiracy theories, or even pushing them into mainstream? What lasting effects do you think this may have?
Oh, I think definitely. I think conspiracy theories have gone from fringe to mainstream just in the last 10 to 15 years. They've always been here. And as we
Yeah.
were just saying, even as recently as 9/11, you have, or 5 years after 9/11, you have a third of the public believing this outlandish conspiracy theory about the US government. But what Trump has done is, push that into the mainstream and, make it acceptable, legitimate for the nation's top officials to say these outrageous things.
That could be dangerous because you could say something, it's a theory, you don't have to prove anything. So you all of a sudden put the burden of proof on the government or whoever you're making the conspiracy theory about, and it could spread like wildfire in social media and create real issues, right?
Right. Right. I mean, well, he already has, right? By saying that he's the true winner of the 2020 election.
Yeah.
So he is, sowing distrust about election outcomes, which can be a very dangerous thing in democracies.
And I guess that's one of the fundamental points about conspiracy theories is that they're theories and they could be said without much evidence. And even when the truth comes out by scientists, by investigators, sometimes the truth is just not as loudly uh, propagated as the conspiracy theory that's been going on for years now, right?
Right.
Yeah, wow. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Olmsted as we get into the perspective. Dr. Olmsted, how does the Taylor Swift slash Kelce conspiracy theory compare to prior conspiracy theories that we talked about?
Well, I'd say that it is a combination of two different kinds of popular conspiracy theories in the United States.
Oh,
First of all, there's the deep state conspiracy theory, right? And the belief that there is this core of people within the government who are conspiring against the people. And so, as I said, this is a theme that I look at in my book that goes back to World War One.
mm-hmm.
But it especially takes off in the 1990s, say the last 30 years, this fear of the deep state. And Trump talks a lot about the deep state. So you have that. And so the conspiracy theory is that the deep state is rigging the football game so that, Taylor Swift has more prominence, so that then when she, supposedly is going to endorse Joe Biden, that'll get more attention, right? So there's the deep state causing the football game to be rigged. And then on the other hand, there's the long tradition of celebrity conspiracy theories.
Oh, we have a
Uh,
long tradition of that.
oh yeah. So, there's lots of conspiracy theories about celebrities who died suddenly who actually aren't dead. So Elvis is alive, Tupac is alive. Conversely, that Paul McCartney is dead, and then he was replaced with some sort of body double back in the 1960s.
Or
Uh,
Elvis is alive.
yeah,
You know, uh, I I was surprised when you said we have a long tradition of conspiracy theories related to celebrities. Weren't celebrities a movie Hollywood also implicated in the McCarthy conspiracy witch hunt? Yeah.
right. Yes, McCarthy believed that Hollywood was well, not just McCarthy. There was actually the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was separate from McCarthy, had a lot of hearings saying that Hollywood was using its power to shape minds by putting out propaganda, communist propaganda in the movies.
I love it. So if you had a crystal ball about the Taylor Swift slash Kelce conspiracy theory, what do you think is going to happen? Is it just going to go away, or is it going to build up more and more up to the election?
I, yeah, I am so bad at predicting. I study the past, and
Yeah,
every
yeah,
time I make predictions, they turn out to be wrong. I mean, I thought when Barack Obama was elected and he said, "I'm going to be fully transparent," I thought, "Oh, well, that's the end of conspiracy theories," because people won't have anything to worry about because the
yeah.
government's going to be transparent. And in fact, that was another inflection point when things got even crazier. But so with that caveat that I'm really bad at this, I wonder if it's just going to run out of steam, because it seems so completely ridiculous, that
Yeah.
absent any evidence, and of course there's no evidence. I just wonder if it's not going to be something we're talking about in a few months, but who knows?
Who knows? Unless Ms. Swift actually comes out and endorses Biden, or
Right.
God forbid she says go vote or something like that, right?
Right.
Um, so, what are the lessons here for Americans? Here, you and I are talking about conspiracy theories for about an hour.
Right. I would say the lesson is, as we were just discussing a little bit earlier, that they can be fun, they can be entertaining. I mean, it's like the Taylor Swift conspiracy theories. They're so absurd that you want to laugh at them.
Yeah.
But actually, they can be very dangerous. So they can endanger groups when people become convinced that, say, the Jews are out to get them, or African Americans are out to get them, and then there's a mass shooting, you know?
Which harks back to some of the conspiracy theories of the 19th century that you were talking about in the first segment of our conversation, right?
Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
they can be very dangerous. They can incite individuals to violence.
Yeah.
And also they can make it difficult for us to tackle collective problems, because if we disagree on, it's not just that we disagree on policies, it's that we disagree on what is truth, what are the facts. And so then it's very hard to have a conversation.
They sort
Uh,
of steal the conversation, right?
right? Yeah. It hijacks the conversation so that you're
Yeah.
no longer having, a respectful disagreement with someone, but you're, accusing your enemy of being a, pedophile, or in league with some of America's enemies, so that it makes
In
it
a
very
pizza
difficult.
shop.
Right, exactly. It
Yeah.
makes it very difficult to solve problems. And then, of course, there's also the fear that, elections could be overthrown, undermined, because of the widespread belief that the deep state is rigging the election.
Yeah. To be sure, there's nothing wrong with having theories and discussing it.
Mhm.
That's how science goes forward anyway. As a historian, you may have some ideas about history, but then other historians come out
Right,
and write books, they confirm it or they disagree with you and they debunk whatever theory you or others may have. But that's not
right.
how conspiracy theories work. They sort of feed on themselves and they grow. Um, if you want our audience to remember just one point after everything we've talked about conspiracy theories, what would that one point be?
That you can fight this.
Oh,
It's
you can
not,
fight this.
yeah. I mean, what you need to do as an individual, what you can do is uh, think before you share a post. Spread this information. There are fact-checking sites out there on the internet. There are some sources that are better than others. You can uh, do your own research, but by doing your own research, don't just like treat every website that you see as equally valid, right? And look at
uh,
who is the author, who is the source. Are there ways to verify this? Is there peer review? And So therefore, try and stop the spread of conspiracy theories and disinformation.
Don't drink and post on social media. That's another thing.
Right.
One of the things, if I may share, I've been reading the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal for a long time, and I got to tell you, it's hard. Some of the articles take 15 minutes to read. But the reason I'm bringing that up here, Dr. Olmsted, is that these are research based articles. There are
Mhm.
many times that I read an article that I'm like, this is almost history. This is almost not news at all. Because you get the news by the time you wake up because it's popping up on your phone and you can have all sorts of theories. But then you read some of these deeper articles, whether it's in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, wherever you want to read it. Even if you come out disagreeing with the conclusion of that article because the opinion piece or whatever is by someone on the other side of the political spectrum, I think you just come out more learned, and also you start doubting that original theory that you had. I think more Americans perhaps should do that.
Right. And it's getting harder, of course, though, because of the shifting media landscape. The Washington Post, LA Times just laid off, what, 20% of their staff.
Yeah,
The legacy media, mainstream media are losing readers. And as a result, people are getting more and more of their news from peer-to-peer sharing.
yeah,
There, there's none of that tradition
yeah,
of fact checking. I mean, you might
yeah,
disagree with something in the New York Times, but at least they are supposed to have a devotion to the idea of being objective and
yeah,
looking for the truth. They're
yeah,
not consciously trying to spin things.
yeah.
And as more and more of those reporters lose their jobs, then what are we left with?
Well, what we're left with is a bunch of pundits, let's say on Fox News, CNN, all these other that are just sharing their opinions versus having someone who's really investigated this. I'm going to age myself here and just say I miss the days of the Peter Jennings of the world, where you would get real in-depth news.
Right.
Dr. Olmsted, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much, Dr. Olmsted.
Thank you.